I'm a huge fan of Sword and Sorcery, as anyone who has read my Silas and Uncle stories or has seen my recent deep dive into the Black Sword hack can tell. And I also love Cyberpunk, though lately I find that reality has become too close to that genre for comfort. While working on stories and adventures in both genres, could not help but notice the similarities between the two. I think if the Conan stories had been written in 2032 rather than in 1932, the genre his stories helped to define might very well have been called Swordpunk. This video is an essay exploring these similarities in more detail. If you like videos like this and would like to see more like this, consider liking down below and subscribing to my channel. Thank you. Now let's get started. I found similarities between Sword and Sorcery and Cyberpunk in both its world building and its typical characters, as well as in the type of stories that tend to be set in these worlds. A common theme in these genres is nihilism. There is no higher good, and nothing is sacred. Be it that the gods are cruel, uncaring, or have left the world altogether in Sword and Sorcery, or that Nietzsche has killed God himself in a typical cyberpunk world. Any moral standard in such a world has to be completely subjective, and as such is severely lacking in most of society. That is especially obvious in characters of power, because another common theme is that power corrupts. That can be any kind of power: political, monetary, sorcerous, or technological power. Corrupt officials and politicians, power-hungry merchants, sorcerer kings, and business moguls with god complexes are typical examples of this. In a world of sorcery, every king is a warlord and a tyrant, and chances are, if they inherited the throne rather than win it themselves, they are also incompetent. That is a trope you will also find in Cyberpunk, only with successful business owners that are the de facto kings in these settings. This goes so far that old, powerful companies will be inherited and run by multiple generations of the same family, and their strict hierarchies form a kind of neo-feudalism. And chances are, in both worlds, the more powerful someone is, the more ruthless and inhumane their actions become. But the trope of corruption through power takes a more physical aspect when it comes to sorcery and technology. I would argue that both serve the same purpose in their settings. In Sword and Sorcery, the latter is often an outside force, unnatural and barely understood by those that use it. And the same goes for technology in Cyberpunk, unnatural and barely understood even by those that use it regularly. Seriously, who of you understands how this device you watched this video on works? I mean, really understands it. The smartphone might as well be a crystal ball, for all we know. And because it is unnatural, both sorcery and technology tend to make those who master it something other than human. In its mild form, it might just be that a character becomes so powerful that they lose touch with common humans. In Jack Vance's Dying Earth, for example, magic does not seem to come from demonic sources, or seems to have corrupting properties in and of itself. But still, most sorcerers in his stories are self-centered assholes and the worst sociopathic tyrants. This becomes worse in a world like Robert E. Howard's Hyperborea, where magic is learned and mastered through pacts with otherworldly entities, demons or old gods. These can alter both mind and body and make sorcerers monstrous in both their actions and their appearance. Similar to this is mastery of technology in a world of cyberpunk, commonly seen in hackers who can alter the virtual world with the power of their thoughts, and thus, through the ubiquitous technology, the real world. But this knowledge and power leaves them bitter and estranged from common people who can't see beyond the surface of the internet presented by big corporations and social media. Interestingly, a master hacker is often called a wizard. Another example are street samurais, or sometimes called edge runners or gillettes. These warriors modify their body with technology and machine parts to become more powerful in battle. But the more flesh they cut away for power, the less human they become. Literally in case of their body, but often in mind as well. Something called cyberpsychosis. They become emotionally cold and distant to other humans. Sometimes they suffer from violent outbursts and complete psychotic breakdowns. Once again, they become monstrous in both body and actions. Another common trope of both genres is the huge divide between the lives of the rich and powerful and the poor and powerless. In a sorcery world, the rich live in marble palaces, eating the best food, served by an army of servants and slaves. And that's very much the same in a cyberpunk world. Only the palaces become skyscrapers of glass and steel, and the army of servants are either robots or wage slaves. In a sorcerer's world, the poor are enslaved or live in slums, barely scraping by through odd jobs, begging or stealing. And it's the same in a cyberpunk world, though sometimes you'll find they get a minimum basic income. But even if that is the case, this is usually so small that it equals only to a feeding of the poor by those in power. In either case, the poor are without power and without perspective. And this leads to another shared trope, the decadence and decline of civilization. In both genres, civilization is ancient and obviously past its glory days. Though states and cities still appear prosperous and powerful, the underlying foundations of economy and society are crumbling. Often, this is a neglect of maintenance. Those in power do not spend the resources needed to keep the base quarters of the city intact, in favor of squandering resources on decadent displays and lavish parties. This leads to urban decay. The city quarters where the poor masses live become desolate slums. Vital infrastructure like aqueducts, sewers, and power grids fall into disrepair. Once fertile fields grow barren through mismanagement and overplanting. Once powerful armies become inefficient, corrupt drains of public money, a place for the elite to shuffle off second sons. And while I'm at that point, old bureaucracies tend to become ever more inefficient and corrupt as time goes on, requiring ever more personnel and money for the same amount of work, until the only way they work is through bribery and the ignoring of laws. And now, into this decaying and corrupt civilization, we enter our protagonists, because only those desperate would call them heroes. These tend to be outsiders, who don't belong into the dominant society. In Sword and Sorcery, the protagonists are often barbarians, literal outsiders, or thieves, who reject the laws of society and only adhere to their own code of personal honor. In Cyberpunk, you get hackers, detectives, punks, and once again thieves, who reject the laws of society and only adhere to their own personal code of honor. I think a barbarian would do well in a cyberpunk world, if there were any uncivilized lands for him to come from. A sword can't be hacked after all. Because these characters are not part of the mainstream society, it means they can move through society unhindered by social norms. At one point, they can work as thieves and steal treasure from the mob, and then they are hired by a king to rescue a princess that has been taken by a rival kingdom or corporation. This makes them perfect vessels for storytelling, be it as protagonists in a novel or player characters in an RPG. Because there's no objective truth, morals, or justice in these worlds, Even characters of questionable morals like hackers, thieves, pirates, and mercenaries can become sympathetic and heroic to us readers and players. We have already established that the state and its laws are uncaring and corrupt. So as long as the characters follow a personal code of honor that we can agree with, we will gladly follow their exploits. Conan the pirate might capture a rich merchant's vessel and slaughter all the guards and crew and disembowel the captain with his sword, but then he will free the slaves from their oars and share the loot with them. So we cheer him on. David the Edgerunner might shoot his way through an army of mobsters and Arasaka security in stylish slow-mo violence. But they were gangsters and company killers anyhow, and David gets the sexy netrunner girl, so I wish we could be in his place. Both the barbarian and the cyberpunk fill the same archetype. They are characters that fight the oppressive, corrupt, established power, be it evil sorcerer kings or CEOs and their media empires. Living only by their own code of personal honor, they bring chaos into a world and society that has become too rigid and orderly. We humans tend to thrive somewhere between order and chaos, and in times when things become too orderly and oppressive, stories of rebels, punks, and barbarians who scorn this social order and trample the crowns of the world under their sandaled feet or stylish neon boots become heroes of our stories. Lastly, Cyberpunk and Sword and Sorcery stories tend to be low fantasy and personal, meaning they are not about world-changing events. The protagonists will not stop the Dark Lord from conquering the world, or bring down the evil corporation and restore justice, equality, and liberty. The stories are more likely detective or mystery plots, or maybe a heist. Just tales of a bunch of characters going after their personal goals or solving a minor issue. Maybe plunder some treasure from a corrupt merchant, or bring the environmental sins of a corporation into the light of social media, so they suffer a proper shitstorm and 5% loss in their stock value. And even if, by grit or pure chance, the characters manage to bring down an entire corporation or become king by their own hand, they won't save the world. They won't change the 100 other slaver kingdoms, or bring an end to the entire exploitative neoliberal system. In the grand scope of things, even their big victories don't matter at all. But as I said, these stories are often small and personal. If the characters are alive at the end and get to celebrate their victory in a smoky tavern or a seedy bar, maybe find love, if only for a night, that is a good ending. Speaking of endings, that's the end of my tale for today. I wish thee safe travels, dreamers, until we shall meet again.